Hey, English 102. All right, so today we've got a lot to do. It shouldn't take us more than 30, well, it'll take you more than 30 minutes, but this video shouldn't be more than 30 minutes. Let me get this out of frame so it's not distracting. But I'd like to look at 3 new poems, and we're going to use those poems to explore and understand the concepts of tone and theme in poetry. And then at this point, you should have already read Whitman, Hughes, and Ginsberg. You should have read I Hear America Singing, I Too, and America by Ginsberg. So I'm going to post links to all of those poems below, and I'm going to post 2 additional links. One link is to, I believe the poem's called Double America. I can't get the written version, so we only have the version of this person reading it. It's by a poet named Sophia Sinclair. It's really, this is like choking me. It's really good, and it fits into sort of this conversation that all the poems are having together about America and American identity and what that means. The other one is called The Palace. It's by Kaveh Akbar, who is one of my favorite poets right now. I actually got to study with him, and he's a wonderful and generous teacher as well. He's just a great person. So that's to say that while Whitman, Hughes, and Ginsberg are all no longer alive, there are living poets who are writing things that are changing the world or the way we see the world, our perception of the world, or giving us language to really talk about things we haven't had language to talk about, and that is so exciting. So anyway, I'm gonna post all the links to all the poems, including the 2 new poems. Well, all the poems we're reading. We're doing 3 together here in this video. You're gonna read and listen to 2 more on your own, The Palace and Double America. And then I'm gonna give you some questions that relate to tone and theme, but also just relate to your own thoughts on the poems. And I would like those questions answered by our next video, which will be next Wednesday. There may be a small video in between where I address some writing stuff, but it's more likely that we'll wait till next Wednesday for that. I was not feeling well this morning or yesterday. I'm feeling fine now, and maybe I'm a hypochondriac. I just, the fear of this illness has gotten to me, and I was exhausted yesterday and stayed in bed all day. So, and then all this past week, I was preparing and trying to figure out what it meant to be in quarantine, and so needless to say, I'm behind, and if you're behind, I understand. I would expect us sort of all to be behind. This is a national emergency. So, having said that, I hope you are all well. Okay, so the other thing that's exciting is that you're going to listen to some of these poems be read by the authors. So we're going to start with, how do I want to do this? Let's start with a discussion of what theme and tone is. It's on your syllabus for a couple days ago, a couple classes ago, so I hope you've read it at this point from your book. But if you have not, knock the computer down. We can look at the book right now. Excuse me. All right. So, theme and tone, I think most of you already know what that means. Tone, I think we touched on this in class. At least we did with fiction, if not in the context of poetry, but the meaning is the same. Tone is the way that the author allows you to understand their or the speaker's opinion about the content of the poem. So Whereas mood is how you, the reader, feel about the piece. What the writer wants to make you feel, that's mood. It's your takeaway from it. Tone is your understanding of what they are saying about the content, their attitude, their position, their feeling toward the content of what they're writing. So there are many things that show tone. Images can show tone. We'll look at something from Carolyn Forche to see how she uses imagery and specific images to show the speaker's feelings. Certainly word choice, diction, and style. I mean, those are the huge things. Diction is like in prose and in poetry, but especially in prose, punctuation does a lot of work to carry out tone. In poetry, line breaks can do that work, and word choice can do that work. Remember, for the most part, generally speaking, poems are a very small space, and so every single punctuation mark, every single line break, every single word choice are all these very small details that are very deliberate and add up to the tone and also the theme. So that brings us to theme. So theme is, I would say, a very simple way of saying it is the overall message of the piece. Your book has a pretty nice way of breaking it down that I wanted to point you towards. So your book is linking tone and theme, which is also what I just did. Tone can lead us to the theme, right? So this is what they say about theme. Our response to the tone of a poem, however it surprises or jars or stirs us, guides us to understand its theme or themes. What the poem expresses about its topic. That's important. A theme is not simply a work's subject or its topic. It is a statement about the topic. All right, so content and theme are not the same thing. A poem could be about someone's death, and the theme of the poem may be processing the enormity of death or some existential grappling with death. That's different than the actual happening of the death. Does that make sense? So I could write you a poem about my first kiss. And the poem, while being on the surface about one specific thing, about a kiss or whatever, may actually be about a young woman's grappling with the enormity of growing up, right? And the theme would be sort of life, not life or death, but life and death, the passage of time, right? So these very concrete things that we can point to about content, especially narrative poetry. Bookmark, let's do a review of the three modes of poetry, the three sort of ways that poems move. So especially narrative poetry, the content may be some very specific actual happenings, but all of those happenings point to a deeper meaning and a bigger idea. And what the poem is saying about those happenings, that's where the theme comes in. So it's kind of the poem's ideas about things, the poem's kind of philosophy about the content. That's what the theme is. How do you tell what the poem's philosophy about the content is? Tone is a huge key. Like I said before, tone gives us entry into what the poet thinks or what the speaker thinks. And those are not always the same thing, so be careful there. The poet may be writing a speaker to have a specific tone that they themselves, the poet, does not share. We've talked about this with fiction. Be careful not to mix up your writer with your characters. However, with poetry, the lines, I think, are a little thinner. Often poets do write from the eye, the subjective eye. Not always, but more often than fiction. I think. I could be wrong about that. That's, as a poet, that's what I want to argue, but who knows. All right, so we could go through all their examples in the book. I don't think I want to, because I have 3 examples and I don't want this video to go on for an hour. Let me turn that off so that's not interrupting us. Hold on. right. Having said that, let us listen to the first poem. This is a poem called "The Colonel" by Caroline Forche. Um, I have a special love for this poem, but I'll let you listen to her talk about it.
This poem is a documentary poem. It comes from May 1978 in San Salvador, El Salvador. It contains an obscenity. I feel I should announce that in advance. I believe it contains actually 2 obscenities. The Colonel. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The Colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The Colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I am tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of his wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught the scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
Okay. So the reason I wanted to share that poem with everybody is because, as she said at the beginning, it's a documentary poem. Documentary poetry has a couple different definitions at this point. I think what Caroline Forche meant by that was it documented a happening. So she was a human rights advocate and activist, and she traveled to El Salvador during a period I don't understand well historically. So perhaps, Javier, if you have some insight into the 70s in El Salvador, let us know. You can send us an email or something. But it was a time of unrest in the country where people in government and in the military there were disappearances of people. And I don't know, I would imagine, as usually is the case, it's people who were somehow in disagreement with the government. But all of that is to say, what's happening, Caroline Forche, the writer, the author, actually went to El Salvador. I assume that this is a true story because she says it is, first of all, in the poem, which doesn't mean we should always believe that, but also because she was actually doing this work, right? And she calls it a documentary poem. And so because it's a documentary poem, I wanted to look at this poem specifically. This is one of my favorite poems ever, and I teach it all the time for everything because it is such a great example of so many different things in poetry. And it's simple and it's accessible, which I like. And you'll notice when you look at it, it looks like more of a paragraph than a poem. So it's really kind of a prose poem, which are my favorite kinds of poems right now. Anyway, But so with a documentary poem and documentary poetry in general, the poem still works the way poems work. It does sort of have a turn at the end. It uses sharp imagery and images. It has very careful language and specific language. But there's also something about this poem. It's not meant to be flowery or to evoke certain feelings from you necessarily. It's really reporting on something. And that makes it different than other kinds of poetry. So I want to look at where the tone, what would be a great exercise, what we would do if we were having class in person, is I would print this poem out and I'd have you highlight all the places where you hear sort of the opinion or the subjective impression of the speaker come through. And let me tell you what I mean by that. All right, so I gotta pull up the poem to have the words in front of me. One moment. So the first line, what you have heard is true. It's not really opinion, but it's bringing in the subjective. So what you have heard, so we the readers, right, listeners, have heard something, right, as if it's a rumor, and the speaker here is telling us it's not a rumor, it's true. There's already sort of a contract or personal element brought into the poem. So although this is a documentary piece, the first line, the opening of the entire poem draws us intimately into the subjective, which is the experience of the speaker, right? We know that because the next line is, I was in his house. All right, then we get this series of details that are the reporting, right? This is the documentary. This is the documentation of what happened. This is not opinion-based. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. In spite of the fact that this is a prose poem, listen to the rhythm of how it builds. There were daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. It's nice rhythm. All right. Details, 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 factual, right? Then we get this line. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. This is a figurative line. The moon does not swing on a black cord. The moon is never not bare, depending on what you mean by bare. And so what we have here is the speaker establishing or further establishing their tone. What swings naked or bare from a small cord over something? A naked light bulb in a basement when you're tied to a chair being interrogated, right? Which, strangely enough, brings us to the end of Billy Collins' poem, Introduction to Poetry. But anyway, so that image of something hanging bare on a cord, like a light bulb swinging over someone's head, in this dimly lit room, it fills us, the reader, with a feeling of foreboding, and that's the mood, right? But the tone helps establish the mood, and so we have the subjective entry into what the world that this person is documenting is. But the world that the person is documenting is frightening to the person documenting it. It may not be frightening to the colonel, for instance. That's how we know it's subjective. That's how we know that the speaker is offering to us her perception and her attitude about the event, and that is tone. All right, so as we move through the poem, I'm not going to give you more examples. You can do this exercise on your own of looking for examples of tone and theme. But as we move through the poem, we have more and more images, some of them figurative, some of them very literal, that are fulfilling the promise of that foreboding line, of the moon swinging bare on a cord, because we realize there is danger in this poem, in this documentation of this experience. And the speaker realizes that too. The speaker knows and is letting us know. And so when we think about the theme of this poem, I would say the theme, just a few that come to mind, is justice versus injustice. Um, Speaking, who's allowed to speak, um, who's allowed to hear, who is allowed to live. Definitely human rights. Um, what what truths are right and what truths are wrong? The Colonel has his own narrative here. He says it at the end, right? I'm tired of fooling around, he said. As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves. That's a pretty specific tone that he's establishing, and that tone is different than Carolyn's tone, the speaker's tone, the writer's tone, and the clash of those tones helps establish the theme. I think this would be an interesting poem to write an essay on, as far as like dissecting the theme. So if you have thoughts on that, let me know, please. I'd love to hear what you think about the theme more. All right, this is my other favorite poem in the world. I mean, I have so many favorite poems, but this is one of my other favorite poems. In fact, like, I think in the videos that are posted on my YouTube channel, which are like all teaching videos, I think like this poem is in several of them. All right, so this is from a book by Charles Simic called The World Doesn't End. I don't think there's a recording of him reading this poem, so I'm going to read it to you, and then we'll go through tone and theme. Very different poem, but I think, than Carolyn Forget's, but I think they complement each other. I would call this, I would call, it's definitely a documentary poem. It's not really, maybe it's a little narrative. It's not persona, because the speaker is themselves. I guess maybe it's narrative and lyric. It's not really lyric. I think it's just narrative. Maybe documentary poetry is a fourth category we should sort of identify. Okay, this one I think is more lyric. Definitely more lyric. Oh, and the review. So, narrative poetry is what it sounds like. It tells a story. There's often an arc. There are characters. There's not necessarily beginning, middle, end, but close to that. And, you know, there's some more, it's rooted in, like I said, a story, and often there's more concrete elements to it. Lyric poetry is all about the interior of the speaker or the writer. So lyric poetry is often a meditation, praise for something. That was kind of like old-timey lyric poetry. I think lyric poetry more often now is grappling with issues or ideas. Often it's not negative, but it's reflective. And then we have dramatic poetry, which would be persona poems, dialogues, I suppose, and any kind of where the speaker becomes somebody else and enters into a different character. You can also, these are not so disparate, you can have a combination of all of them. Okay, so this is untitled From the World Doesn't End. Sorry I'm wiggling, I don't know why I am. I hope it's not too distracting because I can't remember to stop myself. My mother was a braid of black smoke. She bore me swaddled over the burning cities. The sky was a vast and windy place for a child to play. We met many others who were just like us. They were trying to put on their overcoats with arms made of smoke. The high heavens were full of little shrunken deaf ears instead of stars. This poem, the tone, my mother was a braid of black smoke. Smoke can't hold something. Black smoke is usually toxic smoke. You know, smoke from a fire might be gray or white, like a campfire, but like a house fire or a factory fire is black and toxic. So his mother is made of smoke, which is not substantial. She's bearing him swaddled over a burning city. We have a tone of fear and wonder, though. So it's not an entirely negative poem. So he's using these very figurative images, this great, very clear imagery, but like we know it can't be real. Like, of course his mother wasn't made of smoke. Of course they weren't flying through the sky, right? But this idea of being in the sky being a vast place for a child to play, meeting other people like them, we get the sense of running and fleeing, right? And so this idea of, or his tone, the writer's tone of both the surreal or encountering the surreal, expressing insecurity, maybe in fear, and also wonder. The sky was a vast and windy place for a child to play. Note the child is playing. He didn't say the sky is a vast and windy place for a child to cry, right? So there is good and bad in this poem, and the tone really points to that. And a lot of I read this with my 8th and 9th graders, and they were like, "Is it about immigration?" And actually, it very much is. Charles Simic grew up in basically torn area. Well, there were civil conflicts going on in Serbia, which is where he's from. I hope what I'm saying is true. I'm like so bad at details. I'm so sorry. Maybe I should read the back of the book to check. Anyway, his father left to go to a different place that was more stable and get money and to send for his family. And he and his mother and his siblings tried to leave the country, I want to say 3 or 4 times before they were successful in doing so. And no one would help them. They would get to the border and be turned away. Also the cities were burning around them. And so what amazed me about this poem and why I think it's such a powerful poem and about my 8th and 9th graders is that they immediately got it. They had none of that context and they felt it because of the tone. They felt the theme of fleeing, of seeking refuge, of exiting with no context other than the images in the poem and the tone of the poem. Maybe I should leave you a bit of a bio and more context for the poem below the video, since I feel like I really just botched that. I'm sorry. Hopefully you can feel my love of the poem and poetry in spite of my total lack of regard for facts and history. Okay, let's listen to a poem that's new to me, but I'm really excited about and very much fits into sort of the thematic dialogue that's going on between, or the thematic information conversation that's happening between Ginsberg, Hughes, and Whitman, and then we can add Kava and Sinclair to that. I mean Akbar and Sinclair to that. You don't know who they are yet. I already introduced them at the beginning. You haven't read them yet. They're going to be below this video, and I'll send a document that describes everything you're supposed to do in order. So it'd probably be good for you to have the document out while you're watching this willy-nilly video. So this poem is by someone named Jericho Brown, and you get to listen to him read, which I'm grateful for, because Jericho Brown reading his own work is just so much better than me reading Jericho Brown's work. All right, so this poem is called Foreday in the Morning. And in case you're not familiar with that vernacular or that word, Foreday is just before the day, before dawn. Foreday in the morning. All right.
Foreday in the morning. My mother grew morning glories that spilled onto the walkway toward her porch because she was a woman with land who showed as much by giving it color. She told me I could have whatever I worked for. That means she was an American. But she'd say it was because she believed in God. I am ashamed of America and confounded by God. I thank God for my citizenship in spite of the timer set on my life to write these words. I love my mother. I love black women who plant flowers as sheepish as their sons. By the time the blooms unfurl themselves for a few hours of light, the women who tend them are already at work. Blue. I'll never know who started the lie that we are lazy. But I'd love to wake that bastard up at Foreday in the morning, toss him in a truck, and drive him under God past every bus stop in America to see all those black folk waiting to go work for whatever they want. A house, a boy to keep the lawn cut, some color in the yard. My God, we leave things green. It's a poem. Thank you.
I'm Kristen.
Okay, so what did you think of that? Oh my gosh, it's already been a half an hour. I would rather we have a conversation about the Jericho Brown poem, about its theme and the tone. So why don't we do that? I will start. We're gonna do it like simple, low technology need. I'll start a document that's just a Google Doc. You can edit it by adding your comments. Make sure you sign. Excuse me. Sign your name to the comments so we know who you are. I'll say what I think. I think I need a little more time with this poem to think about what I think. And then you can say what you think, and it'll be really exciting. Let's try to do this by Friday, maybe? I'll do it tonight, and then you can add to it when you want to. All right, what's next? Okay, so we went over theme, we went over tone, how they're related to each other. We went over these 3 poems. We're going to have a discussion in writing about Jericho Brown. By the way, the book looks like this. How gorgeous is that? I love it. I just love I think the person on the cover is maybe supposed to be a boy, but also I think that the person on the cover is kind of genderless. And I love how soft and lovely the colors are and the lines are and the flowers. It's just like such gorgeous art. I should find out who did the art. Okay, anyway. So, you are also, if you have not already, reading the Whitman, the Hughes, and the Ginsberg. Remember, Ginsberg uses words that I don't think white people should use, even if they're using them to expose the problem with using them. So, trigger warning for Ginsberg. I'm going to put the links to all of those poems underneath, even though you have them all. And they're accessible online also. And then I'm also going to leave the links for Sophia Sinclair, Double America, and Kava Akbar, The Palace. What I would like us to do is look at Jericho Brown, Sophia Sinclair, Kava Akbar, identify tone and theme for each one of those. Doesn't have to be long, just like a couple sentences for each, explaining why you think that's true, supporting what you think, why you think the theme is what the theme is, why you think the tone is what the tone is. And then I would also like you to think about how Hughes is responding to Whitman. If you want to throw Ginsberg into there, what is Ginsberg adding to that conversation? You can, but I'm more interested in whether or not you think I Too is a rebuttal to I Hear America Singing by Whitman. Because I think it is. But that doesn't mean it is. Either way, I mean, definitely Hughes knew about that poem and was responding to it, but I'm interested in what you think the response is. And how in conversation they are. And do they have to be in conversation? Like Langston Hughes was a black man writing in the 30s in Harlem, and his experience in America was incredibly different, but he was in America because he is a descendant of enslaved people in America, and Whitman leaves all folks of color who built our nation through force, not out of choice, not out of charity, but because they were forced to on pain of death. He leaves them out of I Hear America Singing. How? How can you ignore the entire foundation of the country? especially as a marginalized person. Whitman was a gay man when it was not okay to be gay, at least not socially acceptable. Anyway, I have lots of feelings about this, clearly, but I'd love to hear your feelings because there's no use in me going on about it on a video on YouTube that is accessible to anybody. So I'm going to stop. Also, it's 35 minutes now. I hope you all are well. I'm going to put all of this in writing. Let me know if you have questions. This is due by next Wednesday. If you want to send it earlier. Well, I'd like our discussion about Jericho Brown to be happening by Friday. And everything else is due by Wednesday. You can just email it to me. It'll be kind of like a journal entry. It doesn't have to be long though. I don't want it to be long. I'm behind on your essays, and I do not believe until we're actually writing the essay that you need to be, okay, let me back up. We're doing this so that I can hear your thoughts and that I get to see your thoughts. Because a big part of our class was our discussion in class, and we don't get to have that now. So your responses to me will be sort of replacing that. So it's not a writing assignment. Our writing assignments are reserved for our essays. So this shouldn't be a huge deal. I hope it doesn't stress you out. I really just want to hear your thoughts. This is also a way for me to ensure that you are doing the reading. Not that I want to catch you not doing the reading, but I'm genuinely interested in what you think about these pieces, but also they're important pieces that I think are worth reading and worth talking about. So you shouldn't be writing more than a paragraph for each thing. Like I said, you're identifying tone and theme for Jericho Brown in that joint discussion we'll have, for Double America, and for the Palace. So you're only doing that for 3, and then you are maybe giving me a paragraph or 2 on what you think about the conversation between the 2 poems, I Hear America Singing and I Too. And that's it. I am still grading your essays, like I already said. Once I do grade your essays, we'll have a whole YouTube video probably on some writing practice. I can go over some strengths and weaknesses and growth areas for us as a class. Of course, you'll get individual feedback as well, which is why this is taking me so long, because my individual feedback is involved. And I really feel great right now, but I tried to stretch earlier and I had to stop because my lungs were hurting, which made me really scared. I'm sure everything's fine, but I don't know. It's a weird world right now, and it's easy to get spooked and scared of it. Okay, I'm gonna stop babbling. I miss you. Genuinely, I really miss you guys. I love 102. I'm really sad I won't get to your faces again. Maybe we can... No, I was gonna say maybe we could set something up with Zoom, or even WebEx, or whatever the college uses, but I don't think we can, because I don't think it's fair to ask adults to show up for the same time online, because life is different now than it was before. This is a monumental shift, and we can't pretend that it's business as usual, which is why I'm talking to my screen right now and not your beautiful faces on Friday morning. Be well. Let me know if you have questions.